What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 135 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today I'm going to talk to you about Spider-Man Fairy Tales. This is a 4-issue miniseries from about 10 or 12 years ago, a long time ago, written by several different people, drawn by several different people. You have C.B. Cebulski and Mindy Owens, with art by Ricardo Tercio, Nico Henrichon, Kei Kobayashi, and Nick Dragata. And basically the premise is you have 4 issues, so you have 4 different Spider-Man fairy tale stories here. You get to see different Spider-Man stories through the lens of different fairy tales. The first issue is The Big Bad Wolf, with Mary Jane playing the role of Little Red Riding Hood, but then Peter Parker kind of plays a part in that story also. And then you also get to see some other fairy tales that I wasn't familiar with before reading the story. A few of them are very clearly from other cultures. One of them looks like it's an African fairy tale. One of them is a Japanese fairy tale. So you get to see all these different multicultural stories that all revolve around a Spider-Man of some kind. And I really like this book. I think that this is the perfect book to give to somebody who is a lifelong Spider-Man fan who, for whatever reason, they never read this, or if you know someone who wants to get into Spider-Man and they've never read anything with Spider-Man, this would also be the perfect book for them. And the reason I say that is that each one of these issues handles a different aspect of Spider-Man that is core to the character. It just does it through a fairy tale story. So it's not a traditional superhero story, but it still feels like a real Spider-Man story. For example, one of them is still about with great power comes great responsibility, but it ends in a very different way than that usually ends for Spider-Man, and it also happens in a different way throughout that entire story because it's not a superhero story, it's a fairy tale story. But at the end of the day, this book still feels like a Spider-Man book. It doesn't feel too far off the beaten path. There is an Elseworld story from DC Comics, one that I actually like quite a bit, called JLA Riddle of the Beast, and it's just a pure fantasy story that's got a lot of these superhero characters who have been bent and altered a little bit to fit into this fantasy story. And while I like that story quite a bit, you could say that it doesn't really work as a DC Comics story because a lot of the characters in that story are completely different from how they are in the main DC universe. That is not the case with Spider-Man fairy tales. Even though you have a story here that's just a traditional knight in shining armor story, it still feels like a Spider-Man story. Norman Osborn is still the bad guy, Peter Parker is still the good guy, Gwen Stacy is still his one true love in that particular story. It still feels true to Spider-Man, even though all the trappings are different. And that's why I think that this would be a really good story to hand to somebody who is a huge Spider-Man fan, because they would recognize, hey, this is still a really good Spider-Man story, even though everything else is different about it other than the fact that Peter Parker is still the same kind of character. But this would also be really good to hand to somebody who has never read Spider-Man before, because it would be a good way to introduce them to the character of Spider-Man. There's not any continuity here, even between issues. Each issue is a standalone story, so somebody who doesn't know anything about Spider-Man, they wouldn't have to. They don't have to know that Norman Osborn killed Gwen Stacy, and that Peter Parker let his uncle die, and that Dr. Octopus married Aunt May. They don't have to know any of that whenever they read this. This is all completely standalone, and it would still give them a good introduction to the character of Spider-Man. I really like this book quite a bit more than I thought I would. I thought this was just going to be kind of a disposable, oh, that was cute and that was fun, now I'm going to put it on my shelf and forget that it ever existed. No, this is really good, and I was very surprised by how much I enjoyed this. And I know there was an X-Men Fairy Tales that came out around the same time. I have not read that. Now that I've read this, I really want to go and read X-Men Fairy Tales and see if that's as good as this or better. But anyway, those are my brief thoughts on Spider-Man Fairy Tales. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.